Question number 2, David Shearer, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, does he agree with his Minister of Finance that the mixed ownership program will be good for Kiwi investors, the government and the economy as a whole?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, the mixed ownership program is good for New Zealand savers because it opens up a whole new opportunity to invest in large local companies. It's good for the government on behalf of taxpayers because the proceeds will be invested in new assets like modern schools and hospitals. The money would otherwise have to be borrowed from overseas lenders.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, how are New Zealanders going to be better off if the government sells the assets when they are under threat of court action, possibly reduced in value because of uncertainty and share markets that are currently unstable?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I wouldn't agree with the assertions that the member has on a number of those points. In terms of the latter point, well, equity markets go through various phases, but it hasn't stopped plenty of other companies embarking on the mixed ownership model, including Fairfax recently with its sell down of 49% in trading.
The Leader of the Opposition.
What does he consider the dollar value reduction in the value of Mighty River Power is as a result of the uncertainty over the court action?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I don't think it's possible to speculate that the member is even right in making the assumption.
The Right Honourable Winston Peters. Order. I've called the Right Honourable Winston Peters. I apologise.
If, as the Prime Minister says, and I quote him, nobody owns the water, end of quotes, then on what basis does he purport to sell it?
The Right Honourable Winston Peters. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, if I understand the question correctly, we're proposing to sell 49% of the shares in Mighty River Power, not proposing to sell water.
The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr Speaker, there is no power company in this country that is doing hydropower that does not have to have the
order. Is this a point of order?
Yes, it is.
Oh,
it's naming water. No water, no power company.
Order. That's order. Order. Members may have... I'm on my feet and there will be silence. The Prime Minister gave a perfectly legitimate answer to the member's question. And there's nothing more I can do about that. And certainly the point of order is not a point of order. To debate whether or not selling Mighty River Power is to sell water is not a point of order at all. It's a debating point.
Point of order?
Point of order, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Are you saying it's a debating point that a power company, a hydropower company, doesn't need water?
Order.
It's got more ridiculous by the day.
Now debating further. It is, I invite the member to reflect, it's not remotely a point of order. It's not remotely a point of order. Not under the longest stretch of imagination is that a point of order. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When he said yesterday that it is possible that a court action could, quote, have a cost for Mighty River Power but would for every business and every household in New Zealand, unquote, does he mean that New Zealanders may have to pay for the liability while private shareholders are able to get the profit?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No, I was making an assumption that if one day a court assumed that Maori owned water, and that is the assumption that is put forward by the Maori Council. If you look at the statement made by Manu Paul the other night when he said, "I tell you what you need, and you need a few people to vote for you, and you can become the leader," because the Labour Party now changed the way they elect their leader.
Order.
So, no wonder David Cunliffe's not here. He's out with the unions.
Order. 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 If members interject, they may well have their interjections responded to, and it will tend to lead to disorder. I invite...
Well, as you... I'm waiting for you to sit down.
I'll hear the...
Sometimes it's different occasionally, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, the point I was making, I thought that you were going to reprimand the Prime Minister for suggesting that you may be elected Leader of the Labour Party. That is most unlikely. You haven't taken out your membership
I've heard sufficient. I've heard sufficient. I know it's the first day back after a sort of a break, but I think we've had our fun. The Right Honourable Prime Minister, in reply to the question.
So in reply to the question, the point I was simply making was that some in the Maori Council, for instance, the chairman, Manu Paul, and I quote him when he said on Television 3 the other night, Maori own the fresh water, we need to sit down and work out how much you are going to pay to use our water, is an example where if that was the case, then all businesses and consumers in New Zealand would theoretically have to pay for that right.
The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Does the Prime Minister accept that Mighty River Power cannot operate without water, which he has said nobody owns? That being the case, on what basis does he purport to sell a share of it?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, Mighty River Power don't own water. Mighty River Power have long-term water rights, and the sale would be the sale of the earnings stream, effectively, of Mighty River Power.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the government considering listing some of the SOE shares on the Australian Stock Exchange? And if so, how does that fit with his commitment to have 85 to 90% of the company owned by New Zealanders?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the government hasn't made a decision on that. It's taking advice from Treasury. I'd simply point out that 8 of the top 10 companies on the NZX are also listed on the ASX, including Air New Zealand, that was put on the ASX by the then, I assume, Labor government. But, Mr Speaker, the reason why the advice in one instance has been that it's a good idea to do that is because the mandate of Australian funds that invest on behalf of New Zealanders often require them to be listed on the ASX. On the ASX. The reality is that in terms of New Zealand companies that are dual listed on the exchange, if one looks at those, the vast overwhelming bulk actually trade their shares in New Zealand. So Auckland Airport's 98% traded in New Zealand, 2% on the ASX. Chorus 88% traded in New Zealand, 12% on the NZX. Infratil 96% on the New Zealand Exchange, 4% on the NZX. Sky TV 90% and 10%, and it goes on. So, Mr Speaker, it's possible, but it would simply be for liquidity reasons.
The Leader of the Opposition.
In light of his answer, can he guarantee then that his commitment that he gave at the election last year, that 85 to 90% of the company will be owned by New Zealanders, will stand?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes. And interestingly enough, actually, Mr Speaker, because the government controls the book bill, Mr Speaker, but interestingly enough, actually, when I was in Australia last week or the week before last, I actually met with Origin, who of course have a substantial ownership in Contact Energy. One of the interesting things that the Origin board told me was that, in fact, of the 80,000 plus retail shareholders that they've had in New Zealand, they've stayed consistent for a long period of time. They haven't wanted to sell, despite all the fear-mongering from the Labor Party that there would be sales to overseas people. That hasn't taken place.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Can the Prime Minister give us an undertaking that the Mighty River Power will not be delayed in its sale, or will that sale be having to continue next year?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I can understand that the member's anxious to get his allocation, and in due course he will, but Mr Speaker, in reality, that's certainly the government's intention that the shares are brought to the market in the third quarter of this year. It is not impossible that a court could delay the process, but we would hope that's unlikely.
Question number 3, Colin King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.